Let's proceed this way, folks. You are all more or less familiar with the chapter and intimately familiar with the question about the Sabbath, so I don't think I need to take time expounding. I'll just turn the pages and see where you have the questions. We were more or less on page 328, but at any rate, let's turn to 328. The first point there, that the law of the Sabbath was not first given on Mount Sinai, but inferred from the fact that it referred to it as a known and familiar institution. Remember the Sabbath. Any question about that item number 3 that anybody wants to make? Number 4, it's a strong argument in favor of this conclusion that the law of the Sabbath was taken up and incorporated in the new dispensation by the apostles, the infallible founders of the Christian church. All the Mosaic laws, and here he argues for the fact, just as I do in this, this new edition of the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. I was asked to write the article on the law in the New Testament, and I do discuss the Sabbath as part of the discussion of the law there. But this particular point, especially, that Hodge is making here, that the law of the Sabbath is essentially observed and practiced, apart from these liturgical features we're discussing and some of the civil aspects as well, in the New Testament. Any question on that point? Number 5 on page 3. Yes, please.
How do you address this as, how would a Judaizer look at the Sabbath, for example?
The Sabbath itself? Well, they had learned, the Jews had learned in the Old Testament dispensation, because of their constant violation of that and their severe punishment for their violations, they had learned to be quite strict about that, just as they were strict about the matter of idols. You know, they had been punished for their idolatry, and the Jews shied away from any use of anything that looked like it, and tended to go too much to the extreme of any kind of pictures in their temples. And so on the Sabbath, and that excessive strictness going beyond Moses in the Old Testament law, something which is bringing them into conflict with our Lord, as you know from the New Testament record, completely. Well, the Judaizers, I take it by Judaizers, you're referring to those people who, subsequent to Christ, in the early church, gave the church such momentous trouble. They would, first of all, have tended to go with the Pharisees on the excessive thing and not get the point that our Lord was driving at the same time, that the tendency today is to act as if Christ simply opened the Sabbath up wide. Whenever I get into any kind of an argument with anybody on the subject, the thing they appeal to is that Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, and so on, and Christ is the Lord of the Sabbath, and I have to try to show that his saying that didn't mean that he had abolished the Sabbath, but that the Sabbath was really made for us, and if it's observed, it'll be for our profit, and so on. But I have to go through that line of thinking with most people who object, and I think they're in other words, missing the point of our Lord's teaching on that subject, and I think the Judaizers were missing it too. And we do know, see, the New Testament doesn't tell us precisely the answer. At least I can't think of any place in the New Testament where it answers precisely the question that you are raising. But if you recognize what the Pharisees, from which these groups came, a number of Pharisees were converted later, and so on, that was their tendency. And we do know that what became Judaizing as a problem so momentous that the First General Assembly at Jerusalem had to deal with it was a insistence that these things were absolutely, all of the Mosaic law, the circumcision particularly, but all of the Mosaic law had to be kept if a person was going to be saved. Now, that was bad enough, but they had also fallen into the legalism of supposing that you were saved by these things. That was, of course, a pernicious perversion of the gospel that Paul struggles with mightily in Galatians and especially Romans. The Jews were lost primarily because they were seeking to establish their own righteousness, which was their perverse misunderstanding of the Old Testament law. So I would say the way this whole discussion would bear on the Judaizer problem would be, at 2 points, to show that the Sabbath had not been repealed in essence, just the liturgical features, but that the rabbinic writers, the stricter rabbinic writers, had put various duties on the Sabbath that had not come from Moses, and that was a problem there. And then they had also fallen into that pernicious error of legalism, and we have to be aware of both of them.
What would be your definition of a legalistic observance of the Sabbath today?
Well, the two definitions that circulate on it, you asked what would be my definition. I might use either one, but I would feel it incumbent on me to explain to people who are listening what I mean. As I was saying, you may remember this, Randy, because you asked me for a list of them and so on. A number of words which have a double meaning. And if you don't keep it in mind, you get into all sorts of problems because of that. And legalistic is one of those words. Here it just means totally moral. That is, that you have certain moral codes that it's obligatory to keep. Every one of us in this room is a legalist in that sense. That is, we believe, for example, you can't cheat, you can't lie, you must go to church, and you can't be polygamous, etc., etc., etc. We're legalists in that point, that there are certain obligatory morals. And without recognizing that and endeavoring to keep them, you're not a Christian at all. These are what we commonly call works, you see, and so on. Now, the other use of the word, and the way I was using it a moment ago when you brought the question up, it legalist refers to salvation on the basis of merit achieved by keeping the law. Now, that's another form of salvation altogether. See, that's the absolute antithesis of the gospel. We teach that all of our observation of duties is non-meritorious. We don't do a solitary thing which is perfectly good, for one thing. And even if we did, it wouldn't even deserve thanks. We would only have done our duty. Luke 17:10. Say, after you worked in the field all day and then served your master at night and so on, I am an unprofitable servant. I have only done what is my duty. So that even if a person were perfectly in conformity to all the moral laws, there would be no merit in it whatever. But legalism, in this other sense of the word, actually says that's the way of salvation. Because you keep those laws and avoid those prohibitions and so on, you do achieve merit in God's eyes. And that's the way you're doing. That's what I was referring to in that Romans passage, the Jews for whom Christ was willing to die, the kinsman after the flesh, Paul, was willing to die if it would do them any good and so on. They were not getting any benefit from Christ's sacrifice because they were insisting on establishing their own righteousness. This is the way they did it, by being circumcised, by keeping the Passover, by observing all the regulations and avoiding all the prohibitions about intermarriage with the Gentiles and all that type of thing. That was not just obeying God there. That was the way by which they earned eternal salvation. And essentially, Rome is teaching the same thing in a much more refined way. So the people saying that underneath all this, it's by grace alone, see. And I keep saying the name of the game is the name. And so many people live by that. As long as they can say the right words, the fact that they're cutting out the guts of it and so on, they don't notice. And so on. Rome will insist, sola gratia, by grace alone. But in the last analysis, according to her theology, what actually entitles you, as the Council of Trent says, and I even cited that in the Sunday morning lectures and so on, what the Council of Trent says is that these works you do are what entitle you to eternal life. And that is works righteousness. Granted, they believe in Christ as the Jews don't. Granted, that they believe that Christ died. He puts you on the way, but you are the one who achieve it by this type of thing. And that's the reason I say it's not a Christian religion. It's worse than paganism because it poses as, and it actually has the audacity to say it's the only true church, and that the Pope is actually the vicar of Jesus Christ. But on your word legalism, you see, it has these two meanings. And usually, now I didn't when I was talking with you in the first place before you raised the question, saying I'm pointing it out this way, assuming that you could see, especially by my allusion to Paul, that I was referring to it in this sense of the word. But it's done this way now. If somebody says you're legalistic, he's very seldom trying to congratulate you, see. It's a good, I'm congratulating you, Kay, when I say you're legalistic and you feel you have an obligation to be faithful to your husband and to be kind to your children and to be useful in your community and regular in your church attendance, and you're quite legalistic. You see, you're observing your duties and so on. and all. But the reason that's a pejorative term rather than a complimentary term is when it's used both ways. And actually, if I were saying you were legalistic in this sense of the word, I'd say you're on your way to perdition. You're not a Christian at all. You see, it would be the ultimate warning of you. But you've got to be careful about this. But usually, it's an interesting thing the way people will use it. If somebody, you know, the old joke there, that a man was put out of the Methodist church for for drinking, and then he joined the Episcopal church and was put out for petting, and they said if he'd done his drinking in the Episcopal church and his petting in the Methodist church, it wouldn't be any problem. You know, that kind of a joke that goes around all the time there about the fact that there are differences among Christian people and Christian denominations of the definition of what is morally required enough, but they're using it in this area. Now, suppose I'm a person who could drink, you see, and you're all teetotalers. Then when you condemn my drinking, I say you're legalistic. See? Now, a bad word, but strictly speaking, all I'm meaning is we have a difference of opinion on the use of alcohol. I think it's legitimate. You think it's illegitimate. And we ought to make it perfectly clear. But when you just simply, when I say to you, for example, to justify my consumption of alcohol, and so, which I don't consume, by the way, this is strictly an illustration, but I say that as a drinker, and so on, to you, that you're legalistic. It's just because I don't like the particular law you're hanging on to, you see. And on the other hand, when I get strict, for example, about your petting, and you're all petters, you see, so you look like free in the way in which you relate to the opposite sexes and such things as that, even if it's within, within a certain relationship and all that type of thing. And I say, you're legalistic now. You see, we have a difference of opinion now on the relationship between the... it's a reason you've got to be careful of the use of words here. These are two different... That's a legitimate use of the word. And nobody can be a Christian without being legalistic in that sense of the word. If there's anybody here who's not legalistic, he's an antinomian, you see. An antinomian is a person who doesn't believe that any law is obligatory. It's advisable. It's rewardable. But one thing it is not, obligatory. That's the reason I say dispensationalism, because it has antinomianism tied in with it. And antinomianism, with or without dispensationalism, is because it doesn't have this feature of mandatory duty and so on. It is antinomian. And I've also said in this connection here that the problem with many with many people not being able to see the difference between these two and the validity of it. They can't see the difference between necessary works and meritorious works. As soon as I say works are necessary, see, I'm meaning this. They hear that. They say this is legalism. They mean it's another gospel. Can't be so. And the only way they can avoid that is by throwing this out. A classic case of throwing out the baby with the water. The only way you can be sure that you're preaching grace and grace only in their minds, which are not clear and sound minds, and so the only way you can avoid this is by avoiding that. As soon as I say you must, I even went through this with one of them once who's been delivered from that particular heresy now. The real litmus easy test is the difference between should and must. Every dispensational antinomian will say you should keep the law. It'll even have an eternal reward for you. Okay? And you won't be happy without doing it. I'll tell you all sorts of disadvantages and advantages. And underline the fact that you should do it. I think I told you in my dialogue with Charles Hodge on that particular point. When I accused him of antinomianism, he first of all disavowed it. He honestly thinks he's not an antinomian. And the way by which he disavowed it was to show how much he insisted on the advisability of keeping the law. See? He sent me a book marked out with all sorts of underlining on the benefit of that. I said, Charles Hodge, I am not saying you don't recommend the keeping of the law. I know you do, and I know you believe there are rewards connected with it and so on, but there's nothing in your book, and I've never seen anything come out of your mind which indicates that it's mandatory that you do that. Okay? But if you don't say that, you're an antinomian, no matter how much you recommend the advisability of it. And I maintain that I haven't met a dispensationalist who will actually say must. I think I told you about that themite that I had, didn't I, the other day? That themite I had in my class there in didn't I mention Trinity? This last January, I taught a crash course in church history the other day, and so on. And you know Bob Thiem in Houston. He's the kind of ultimate dispensationalist and so on. This is one of his disciples. He had a hotline going out. They call him, and he calls them. He had quite a connection. He's a very able man, but very thoroughgoing in his radicalism. But this particular fellow here in my class here, he's a real Themite. And this one day we were alone after class there, and I took about 15 minutes trying to get him to see this particular point. And because he didn't want to admit it. See, they don't like this idea of being called antinomians, easy believers, carnal gospelers, as Perkins says, and so on. So you should have listened to this. For about 15 minutes, I got him to see whether he would say, this is sort of putting in one sentence what it took me 15 minutes back and forth to get over, to see if he would say that a practicing murderer couldn't possibly be a Christian. Now, if anybody in this class couldn't answer that like this, I would give up the ghost myself and so on. Of course it's impossible for a practicing murderer to be a Christian. Anyway, I mean, understand, a practicing murderer who had once professed the faith, had gone down the aisle, that type of thing, and so on. But you should watch it. You couldn't get out of him, a practicing murderer may be a Christian. You couldn't get him to say that. But neither could you get him to say a practicing murderer is not a Christian. See? Couldn't do it. 15 minutes. When I put a guy through the rope ringer, he goes through. And this fellow got through. But I could not squeeze that out of him. That particular, it was built right into. He doesn't want to say that, see? He doesn't want to look as if he's championing the possibility of hitmen for the mafia being Christians on their way to glory. They don't like to say it that way, see? So when you get them to try to get them to say something, your lawyer would know that. Try to get them to say something. You make that joke and mention, don't answer that question. It's just a trick to get the truth out of you. That was the trick I was trying to. I'm trying to get the truth out of this fellow. And for 15 minutes, I put him under the roller. And he didn't want to say a practicing murderer may be a Christian. But on the other hand, I couldn't get him to say that a man who had professed Christ, even though he had practiced murder for 25 years, couldn't possibly be a Christian. I couldn't get him to say it. Well, you should have watched that. See? That's what I maintain is a genuine antinomian. And dispensationalists have a very thoroughgoing branch of that, but he will not say much. Should? What's such a reward? Discomfort to be done. All the rest of it is it must know. But I went through this with, as I say, a former dispensationalist who's come out of that tradition at one time, and he said to me, 5 years ago, I could not have said must. I've learned how to say must now. But when a man can say must, he's no longer a dispensationalist, thank God. Yes. Okay.
Be at that time. And you're convinced that it's not a meritorious work.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But then when you're working out of what you do, and what is lawful, what really pleases God on the Sabbath, there's some things that are clear. Worship, prayer, singing hymns, those things. But then there are the gray areas, getting together with other Christians or making long-distance phone calls, because the rates are low. Maybe that's a black. That may not be great. What are the criteria that you use in determining whether a particular activity on Sabbath is really pleasing to God?
Well, the criteria, according to this, if you kept that principle, is acts of worship and acts of mercy, you see, and so on, and the rest and all there. But I think the question you're really after there, Dale, is this. Suppose a person really wants to do what God commands him to do on the Sabbath day. He has no intention of violating it. But as a matter of fact, suppose he does violate the Sabbath day, is what God actually means. Then what is the status of that person? I would say that's the status of a person who is truly a Christian individual, who nevertheless is mistaking God's judgment on this matter. And though he'll probably feel some chastening for it or so on, it would not be an indication of the fact that the person was not a Christian. You see what you have when you're trying to, I think this in your head me off if I'm going down the wrong track.
I'm interested in what you're saying, but that wasn't really...
Yeah, that's what I mean.
You use it back to back. I guess
Better for you to say that than for my wife to say it on the way home. You know, you didn't answer Dale's question.
Okay, I struggle. Thank you.
Yeah, you wouldn't say that to Paul, would you?
I struggle every Sunday with things that I do. Is this pleasing to God? This particular thing that I'm doing. And as I say, there are some things that are very clear. But then there are other things. Having guests in for dinner, preparing a dinner for guests. How do you know whether what you're doing is really pleasing to God? In those gray areas that aren't obvious.
Yeah, well, they're the principles. Whatever is not of faith is sin. You've got to satisfy yourself that you can conscientiously believe that would be legitimate. But if you thought, for example, that it was not legitimate, even though, for example, I thought it was legitimate, you didn't. It wouldn't make any difference. You couldn't dare do it. And I would say, poor Dale.
I can't do very much.
Poor Dale is all hung up.
I don't know. It's not that I feel like...
I know, that's what I say. As long as your conscience is clear on that, and it's an area where you are working within the sphere. I mean, you're not throwing over the Sabbath. You're not saying, I don't care what God says about the Sabbath. There's nothing like that. No, you're a daughter of Zion. You want to do God's will on this matter. But how it applies to your entertaining of guests or something like that, you just can't draw any clear... There's certainly no explicit statement on that. You can't draw any clear conclusion from it and so on. And to the best of your conscientious judgment, you say yes or no to a point like that. You'd have to, as long as it's your conscientious judgment, I think it would be honestly forgiven.
Okay, so that going on with what you were going to say originally.
Well, I was going into the general principle. I was going into the general principle of what is necessary to be a Christian as far as this sort of thing is concerned. There has to be obedience to clear commands of God. Striving for it. It's not perfect, to be sure, but there has to be that thing. And secondly, there has to be a proper attitude. See, as Perkins is bringing out, there's some people who reform their lives quite meticulously, you see, out of fear or some reason like that, but they don't really have an attitude of faith there. And this is the point which would come into play in an area like you. Here's a person who recognizes that God has given a commandment about the Sabbath, who studied it very carefully and is very conscientiously trying to ascertain its application in areas where God has not spoken explicitly. Well, in a case like that, it seems to me that the thing that would be absolutely essential here is that your attitude is to be obedient. And if anybody can show that your present practice, or you can come to the conclusion that your present practice is not compatible with the Sabbath, you'd give it up instantly. But God, who's a searcher of heart, he knows that, see. Even Larry may not know that. You may not even know that, but God does know that. And on the other hand, if you just sort of really have an inner desire to do this thing regardless of God, and you're just scared, and you don't want to thumb your nose at heaven in so many words and so on, so many gestures and so on, that would betray the fact, even though outwardly you might be very, very scrupulous in your observance. You see, I couldn't observe that. I wouldn't know that. As I say, even Larry wouldn't know that. God would know it. The reason I tell that story had nothing to do with the Sabbath, about that girl I think was on her way to hell because she was using cosmetics. Remember? Because she thought it was a sin. See, I didn't think it was a sin. These kids who would sort of cajoled her into it and mocked her into it, they didn't think it was a sin. But she did. The meat offered to idols, eating it was no sin. But for people who thought it was a soul-destroying sin. And Paul would not in any way encourage them to violate it. This principle of, you see, this is objective. This is faith as a creed, and this is faith as an attitude. The creed has to be basically sound, you see. It has to be the biblical faith. If it denies the deity of Jesus Christ or something like it can't be a solid. It doesn't make any difference what your attitude is here. It doesn't matter. The faith is not there. But suppose your faith is there. It's full-rounded, thoroughgoing Calvinistic, Orthodox type of faith, and so on. If it's not here, if you're subscribing, and as I say, the thing I have to examine myself, I like the symmetry of it. I like a neat, worked-out thought. You know, that pattern of Calvinism is that. Arminianism is just a bundle of confusion. It annoys me that way. And see, why do I like Calvinism? Because I like neat thought. So, It doesn't, I don't have to have a regenerate heart for that. It's part of my natural makeup. And so I have to ask myself, why do I do that? See, why do I have faith in it? Is it because of the neatness of the system, fitting in with one's pattern of thought and such things as that? Or is it because it's the revelation of God, you see? But the faith is there. That's an authentic form of Christianity, in my opinion, the best form of Christianity, and so on. But then the question would be, why do I do it? But these are the two things. That the faith has to be there. It has to be basic orthodoxy. I don't think it has to be Calvinism. But it depends on how thoroughgoing a person is in his thinking. But it has to be basic orthodoxy. That's why we say a Unitarian who really believes there's no hope for his salvation. Because he doesn't have the gospel. It's just not there, you see. That's all there is to it. It doesn't make any difference how conscientious he may seem to be. He's worshiping some sort of an idol. But on the other hand, you could have that there, but it wouldn't be the motive. Now, you were dealing with a very fine point about the Sabbath. Now, the Sabbath has to be respected because it's a divine commandment. If you wrote it off as of no significance to you because you don't care whether God commanded it or not, then, of course, it wouldn't really even be a proper object of faith. But down here, where what you call the gray areas, or what I'd say is not spelled out in the Bible, and you don't see a clear implication of it. See, the two ways by which God teaches, in words or by implication, explicitly or implicitly. And it's not explicit. It's never written anywhere, thou shalt not entertain friends on Sabbath day. You see, it's not explicit. But is the understanding of the Sabbath such that it would rule out or permit that type of thing? Well, Dale Yeager can't decide that. He can't have any confidence. He's very conscientiously considering that anybody could convince her one way or the other. She'll follow, and she'll follow what she understands that. Then her faith is in order. She really does trust, even if you're wrong in it, even if you're mistaken in it, in that matter. The two things are there. A basic adherence to the commandment of God. And willing to do whatever he commands you to do. You definitely do that, and you're doing it because it's his commandment, not any other reason. Those two things are in line. I'd say you can have assurance even when you may think you're making mistakes. Whatever's not a faith is sin. It's just a faith. That was getting at what was underneath it, I thought. Okay, he deals with objections starting on page 331. And the first one he mentions is an objection is drawn from the absence of any express command about the Sabbath. It's been observed, almost all the 10 Commandments are restated one time or another in the New Testament. The Sabbath is not stated in so many words in the New Testament. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy and all. He points out, though, that it's inferred and that because there wouldn't be any argument there just because God doesn't mention it again. He'd have to repeal it. I mean, if God's made a law, the only way you and I can disregard it is by having evidence that he's repealed it. Any law. And if he certainly made the Sabbath commandment, and nobody I've ever heard of has said that he has said he's repealed it. And so he criticized the Pharisaic interpretations, and he did certain things which were contrary to their interpretation. We know when Christ does something that if anybody finds fault, his interpretation's at fault, not Christ, and so on. But he honors the moral law, and it's a part of the moral law, and so on. So that's the way he deals with that question. Anybody have any point that he wishes to make about that matter? There's another objection here that somewhere, I don't know exactly where, that we might take a moment on. Some people object to the Sabbath law and how he develops that point that it's the spirit of the thing. It's a spirit or an attitude that would really apply to all days of the week. That's really necessary. Having a worshipful attitude applying to all days, and that in a certain sense, that's more compatible, they will argue, with the New Testament spirit, that it's much more spiritual and much more comprehensive, and in the days when the church was in its childhood, it had to have more explicit directions and detailed directions, laborious directions, that you do with children who have to be taught everything from square one and all, and now mature. And what is really the spirit of the commandment is to worship God in spirit and in truth. And that really doesn't have any particular significance about one day of the week or the other. It is true there's a value in corporate worship, and the sacraments would have to be administered in the company of other Christians. You couldn't do it alone. But if you have a spirit of worshiping Christ and observing anything he does command, as, for example, this do in remembrance of me, and to be baptized, you've been baptized, you receive the sacrament, since he doesn't say how often, so that you receive it, and so on, then if you have this attitude, it's really better than the other. In the Old Testament, they require 10% of your income now, and then argue that tithe is no longer mandatory, but what you realize is you belong to God entirely. You just have 10% of your income. He has you and everything you have and own, and so on, and you just have to judge the way best you can serve him, whether it was 1% or 99%, as the case may be. The famous scientist, Faraday, would give away money as fast as he earned it, and when he finished his career there, he had to be supported by the state. And he made so many contributions that the state was perfectly willing to support him, but that man just gave away every cent. He was in poverty all the time because he always did that. But there's nothing which says you have to do that, except unless you're a rich young ruler, and so on. So the Spirit is to do it. So all of my 100% of everything I own belongs to God. But in the Old Testament, to teach me that lesson, he required me to give 10%. Now he doesn't specify 1% or 100%. I have to make up the judgment whether I give absolutely everything or conceivably nothing, as the case may be. But as Edwards deals with this type of objection in more detail here than the other, but Hodge deals with it essentially. The Spirit alone is not enough. We're tangible people, and you have to have a building in which to worship God. And there has to be a day in which to worship God. And there has to be a certain kind of laying aside as the Lord prospers you, and so on. So if you can't ever become detached, otherwise you go the Quaker route and you dispense with baptism altogether, and you dispense with the Lord's Supper altogether, because these things represent spiritual realities too. And as long as you get the fundamental concept of the washing away of sins and the actual communion with Jesus Christ, then you don't need the outward sacrament. Well, we all recoil at a point like that. But if we do recoil at that point and say, Jesus says this, do this in remembrance of me, there's no way of justifying doing away with a mandate of Jesus Christ. And so we're brought back to home base here with the fact that the Spirit alone is not necessary. We're tangible bodily beings. We have to be motivated in the Spirit, but with respect to concrete realities. And so he would say, it's a specific day. Will you worship him in your work? You go to your various and sundry jobs tomorrow and so on. You're going to worship him there. You're going to serve him there, but not the way you serve him in church, not the way you worship him in church. It's a different formal type of thing with professional instruction from your pastor and such things as that. That's the way he deals with that problem. I don't know if any of you want to raise it. Any other objection you can think of that he mentions or doesn't mention that you want to bring up in this connection? If not, we might take a look at the Sunday laws. You see, now, this is interesting. Remember, this book was finally published just about 100 years ago, and the so-called blue laws, you use that expression in Kansas? The so-called blue laws, were quite universal, and they were already being sapped away at the foundations, and Hodge is raising a mighty objection to doing away with those things. We can imagine how vehement he would be today if he hadn't changed his mind in the meantime. Does anybody want to raise any questions about this matter of stores being open on Sunday and that type of... no particular, but just the latter part of it, where he takes up page 340, the Sunday laws, that type of thing. Did you have that? 339? Yeah, you can do whatever you wish, sir. 239? 339?
Again, on Dale's question on Luke 14.
Yes.
I don't find an indication that was a wedding. It appears, unless I'm missing something, it appears that it was just a gathering where they were eating.
You're still asking a question about the entertainment?
Yes, I am. About amusement, entertainment.
I haven't learned anything in the last half hour.
But I thought that you referred to it as a wedding, and you were talking at the time.
Yeah, I thought it may be.
Yeah. I did not find that this is a wedding, and so I
okay.
wondered if...
Make that clear then. That Cana reference is irrelevant. I was just speculating. I don't know, but you put that speculation about Cana to death, all right, by looking at John 2 there. But as far as what Hodge has in mind by entertainment that he thinks is legitimate, that Christ was observing, I have to look at this passage more clearly to see what he's driving at here, okay? But he certainly, Hodge, I mean, what Christ is driving at, but Hodge certainly does feel that there's some allowance here for entertainment, judging from Christ's example. But when you ask what is the entertainment that Charles Hodge would have thought was legitimate, there, I just don't know what that is. Yeah, whether this is I want to look at that more closely as to whether that's a legitimate deduction there. I'll make a note of that and comment on it next week, but I'll have to probe that a bit more. But it still doesn't answer the other question, which was in your mind as the sequel to that, if the other. But what you're asking really is, did Christ actually open the door where I, K. Brooks, have to wrestle with the question of what, if he closed the door, then if the door's closed, at least the problems are solved. I get that, yes, please. It feels strong about that French positivist, didn't it? Of course, you know the saying about him that somebody once asked him, "Who is your God?" and he gave him a mirror. You know, look at the mirror. He was a thoroughgoing radical humanist, no doubt about it. And if Hodge called him the worst of all, and Hodge is pretty familiar with those 19th century criminal thinkers and so on, so it does seem strange. Yeah, we worship far worse than your face anymore.
Hodge were able to speak with us today with the knowledge of our current history, that he would even attempt to make any kind of a case that we are a Christian and a Protestant nation.
He would certainly feel, I think, that the drift of American culture is denying that rootage altogether. I think he would still say that's our historical background, that's where we come from, and that Presbyterianism has shaped our Constitution, you know, and that type of thing he would say. We're at a low ebb with respect to, because he'd realize the state of the church, which was the champion of that type of thing, is in Pittsburgh, when Pittsburgh Seminary had a debate some years ago on the state church legislation they were passing. Elwin Smith, my colleague, was asked to defend that, and I was asked to critique it from the classical position. But it was a major shift away on the part of the Presbyterian Church from the kind of sort of Presbyterian foundation that was laid, our checks and balances based on the corruption of human nature and a failure to trust anybody else and all, C.S. Lewis and Muggeridge and a number of other people point out. That's thoroughly Presbyterian, that's thoroughly original sin type of thinking. It's a hangover from the past that we're getting away from more and more, but I wouldn't be surprised if Charles Hodge would say the thing has gotten much worse than in my century, but you still can't deny that rootage, and we got to struggle to try to preserve as much as we can, and if possible reverse the procedure. That's where the theonomists are very strong. They're very confident, they're very post-millenarian, and they work steadily for the bringing of our civil practices in line with the Old Testament, far more rigorously than Charles Hodge would have done. You could tell you that Charles Hodge is pretty much looser of cities of refuge concepts and things like that than these people are, but the root's still there. That's an important thing, I would think. And as a lawyer, you would be interested in certain aspects of law that could certainly be compatible with, say, the Westminster Confession of Faith, and certain developments which would not be. Would have to be. We don't say if this is out of line with the Westminster Confession, is therefore illegal or unconstitutional, or un-American, or something like that. But as a practicing lawyer who's perceptive about the reform background of things, I think he would notice things like that, and it would have a certain degree of this case in New Jersey. Has it come into print yet, where there's a woman on being fed, by artificial means? Has that been settled? Did you notice?
The court, the appellate court ruled that they could speak to, and also directed that she could be given whatever barbiturates she needed to keep her from being in pain.
Was it settled that way? That she couldn't be taken off that food supply?
Well, she is taken off the food supply.
She did. Has she died yet?
No.
You only have about a few days, once they take you off food. But that was the rule.
I'm not
but
sure.
But you see,
I'm not sure they have implemented the court's mandate yet.
But that was a court decision.
That's the decision.
The reason I mentioned it is the Surgeon General, Dr. Koop, he chased all around the country his telephone to try to track me down when I was last January, because I'm Presbyterian who would be sympathetic with his view, which was opposed to that, And see, this woman was a Presbyterian, Jobus. I'm talking about Jobus, Jobes, right? He's a Presbyterian, and Coop was very much distressed, and the lawyers who were working on the case, he was in the background, he wasn't immediately involved, but the reason they were trying to track us down, because the Presbyterians were defending the withdrawal of this food support system, artificial food support system, and they suspected that this Presbyterian would not approve of that, and that's the reason they were trying to track me down. They got me. I talked with the lawyer and all. I wasn't able to get to the case, but I doubt if it made any difference. But I said to him, if you're talking about Presbyterianism, there is no doubt that the Presbyterian Church has moved in that direction, moved pro-abortion and pro-quality of life as over against life itself and that type of thing. If these people who are Presbyterians, they could get almost every seminary professor from Princeton who's nearby, you see, and so on, to testify on behalf of that as Presbyterians, you see. The only way in which I could testify on the thing as so-called expert witness, Randy, you're always involved in that type of thing, would be the fact that the historic position of the Presbyterian Church is that death does not occur until the soul and the body are actually separated. And that has not been settled in a case like that. And I would have gone on to say something which would sound liberal to some people. I did relay all this over the phone to the lawyer, but his lawyer's wife, as a matter of fact, he wasn't there at the time. She took notes on this, and if they tried to catch me, they couldn't have got me at Yale anyway, because the phone was not connected at the time. But it wouldn't have made any difference, because for every person like myself in the Presbyterian Church, a professor and all that type of thing, you know, there would have been 10 others who would testify the other way. So if you're just wanting to say, they're trying to get an argument. The Presbyterian Church, in which this woman belonged, is not in support of that. In fact, in spite of the fact that her elder is, her minister is, and these other professors and so on. But that would be the kind of case we're getting. But I just cite that to indicate the fact that the Presbyterian Church itself has drifted so far away from it. This is what would distress Charles Hodge. It's no wonder the country has, if the Presbyterian Church has had such a power in the past. We had much more then. We're now a denomination of 3 million, you know, with a few smaller Presbyterian groups, and much smaller than the Methodist Church and the Baptist Church, not to mention the Roman Catholic Church and so on. And we don't begin to have the clout we had numerically and influentially, but still we have quite a witness there. But it itself has been so weakened. You see, I have to fight with my own denomination. It's not a matter of being united with the denomination on historic Presbyterian ground. Yeah. They said to me on the phone that she was able to respond with movements of the hand or something like that, and she was not in a coma. That was the difference between her and the Quinlan girl, you know.
Brain dead. Not brain dead. That's the question.
Well, they're talking about brain waves being the indication anymore of it. That's what the courts are working with. What's the definition of death, of course? And I was saying the classic, this is where the Presbyterianism would come in, insofar as it had any bearing on the case at all, and what the judge would make of it and all. And it was having a bearing because this woman was a Presbyterian, is a Presbyterian, and apparently her pastor and these other people were justifying the withdrawal. And they couldn't get a yes or no answer from her. A living will, I think, is an immoral thing. Myself, I think I could prove that if you're looking at historic Presbyterianism, you see. This would depend on what the judge is. What do we do? Say, here's a man who makes an impressive case for historic Presbyterianism, but the Presbyterian Church isn't there anymore. What do we say is the testimony of the Presbyterian Church? And you know the way that would go, especially with a much larger number of people on the other side. Time for one last question. Yes, please.
So then, in summary, you would say that we, as Christians, must, in some form, and work that form out in our hearts,
yeah,
keep the Sabbath.
Outwardly and in your heart. Keep the Sabbath. Yeah.
And for those of us who don't always, then who are we? What's our relationship?
Well, I mean, if you recognize that as a duty, you're asking me what I think. If you recognize that as a duty and don't do it, then you're disavowing your Lord, aren't you? I mean,
I don't think so, because I can't
yeah,
always do it.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. But I would, see, suppose believing as I do, I defied the Sabbath. I played ball and went to the super games and all that type of thing and so on. I couldn't possibly be a Christian. I would be violating what I believe that Christ has commanded. Now, you could do all that sort of thing and be a Christian if you could satisfy yourself, if Dale could satisfy herself. I don't believe that the law of God concerning the Sabbath day rules out the possibility of my playing games or watching TV or that type of, secular activities on the TV is over against sermons and things of that kind in the morning. All sorts of programs. Most all of them are fundamentalists, too. It's an interesting thing. They don't want to raise the money to get it. You have to have a whole body of people to get one of the liberals. It's an interesting thing that way. But anyway, the secular use of the Sabbath day, Sunday papers, I say 3 or 4 hours. I think most people desecrate the Sabbath for at least 4 or 5 hours reading the paper on Sunday. Now, you could do that conceivably, you see, conscientiously, because you don't believe Calvin could. They had a Sunday paper in Geneva in those days. He could presumably have read the Geneva Times on Sunday afternoon after the service and all. But if I did that, I would be on my way to perdition. It would be an open defiance of what I believe to be the Word of God. As I say, it doesn't have to be something like a commandment. It's just if I believe God commanded me to part my remaining hair in the middle, and I didn't do it, it's in the same category with meat offered to idols. If I thought it was sinful, that girl thought that cosmetics was sinful, and she was deliberately violating the will of God. She was perishing for that.
So it becomes an attitude of defiance that we...
The two things,
that
yes.
we scrutinize.
The law itself and the attitude.
Right. When we say that we must keep the law.
Yeah, you must keep it. Right. Endeavor to keep it.
We don't say that we should, we say that we must.
Yeah. We should and
we're
must.
both going to wind up in the same spot because we know either the people that say we should and the people that say that we must, we all know that we can't.
Perfectly.
Always.
The must means strive for.
Okay.
You understand?
Even though that the guy that says that he should may wind up doing a better job of it than the guy that says that you must.
Yeah.
It's all a matter of
but he wouldn't be
defiance.
doing it as an act of obedience to Christ.
Right.
He'd be doing it because of the rewards he'd think he'd get from it or something like that.
Would he?
Because if he was doing it as a matter of duty to Christ, then it would be must, you see. A thing is, once a thing is a duty, then it's a must. It's not optional once Christ commands something, or you believe that Christ commands something here. But you see, both of these principles here, if a person had a conviction that the Sabbath obligation continued in any sense whatever, the Continental Sabbath Puritan, the thinnest of the Continental Sabbath observances, if he believed any of that and still disregarded it, he would be in open defiance of Jesus Christ. If a person believes in the Puritan Sabbath, as I do, and he defied that, he would be defying what he believes in Jesus Christ. And for me to say, I believe Christ requires me to observe the 24-hour Sabbath with certain implications and so on that I may draw, that Dale may not draw, and so on, and then defied it, of course I'm not a Christian. Just saying, Lord, this is what you want me to do. I'm not about to do it. I would be like those people that Perkins mentioned who reform themselves in many, many ways, but here's an area. Nobody's going to make me keep a Sabbath for 1 minute. Not even Jesus Christ. There you go. I may preach an absolutely perfect gospel, but I'm perfectly on my way to perdition in a case like that. Shall we close with a word of prayer? Our Heavenly Father, we thank Thee for this opportunity, especially in these immediately practical concerns where we have to make daily and weekly judgments, and frequently they are difficult, and made all the more difficult because of divergent opinions of very respectable scholars who honor Thy word and sincerely endeavor to obey it. We thank Thee, our Father, for them because it makes us realize how close we must walk to Thee, how careful we must be in the consideration of our duties in all regards, and the impossibility of being indolent and indifferent and apathetic. We thank Thee, our Father, that there is forgiveness with Thee, that Thou mayest be feared. There's no one of us here who thinks for a moment that we ever do anything perfectly satisfactory to You, but we sin in all things. No matter how much we endeavor, it is very little and relatively unsuccessful. And it's only Thy mercy over all Thy works which brings us at last to our eternal destination. Help us, our Father, in our hearts to do all that Thou hast commanded in Thy word, with the assurance that if that is the case, Thou art ready and willing to pardon our transgressions and to empower us to make real progress and steady progress, however inadequate and imperfect it may be, in the way of obedience and on that narrow, straight and narrow path which does indeed lead to eternal life. In Christ's name, amen.